Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo. I'm a partner at Next Year. Next Year is a multi-competency advisory firm that's focused on helping Africa solve its most complex development challenges. And as the Igbo saying goes, he who does not know where the rain started to fall on him may not or will not know where it stopped. And it's for this reason that we thought this topic is important today, because if we fail to examine our histories or the roots that has borne the trees or the leaves that we're dealing with today, we set ourselves up for failure. And that's the reason why sometimes when people talk about Nigeria, it appears that Nigeria started life in 1914 during that amalgamation of the Northern and the Southern Protectorate. But our guest today has taken us back to the 1500s, the earliest recorded evidence of life in the area that has become known now as Nigeria. The book we're discussing today, Max Siollun's The Forgotten Era, insists on this longer lens, the 1500s, when this territory that is Nigeria today already had a mosaic of sophisticated polities, each with its own answers to questions we're still wrestling with today. Max is a British Nigerian historian, probably one of the most recognizable, contemporary historians in Nigeria today, who specializes in Nigerian history with a particular focus on the Nigerian military and how it affects or has continued to affect Nigeria's socio-political trajectory from pre-colonial times to today. He's authored 5 really excellent books. The trilogy on Nigeria's military past, Oil, Politics and Violence, 1966 to 76. The second book, Soldiers of Fortune, Nigeria's Politics from Buhari to Babangida, 1983 to 93. And the third, Nigeria's Soldiers of Fortune, the Abacha and Obasanjo years, are excellent reads for anyone who really wants to understand our military past and how we got there and how it continues to impact life in Nigeria today. In 2021, he took us back. He published What Britain Did to Nigeria, a short history of conquest and rule. And this year, he's gifted us with The Forgotten Era, Nigeria's before British rule. Max Siollun was educated in England and graduated from the University of London. Max, welcome.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to this conversation as well.
Fantastic. I've been looking forward to it all week long. Now, your previous trilogy ended with the military rule. Then you went back to the colonial era with What Britain Did to Nigeria. With The Forgotten Era, you've gone even further back, to the 1500s. What gap in Nigeria's policy discourse convinced you that, we must explore our earliest recorded history to understand what we're dealing with in these contemporary times?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And it's one that actually engaged me when I was preparing the book greatly. And when I say the book, I mean the previous book, What Britain Did to Nigeria. And it occurred to me that, number one, the pre-colonial era there's not really much literature about pre-colonial Africa, let alone pre-colonial Nigeria. Mm-hmm. Hence the title, The Forgotten Era. And then secondly, it also occurred to me that most books about pre-independence Africa are about 2 things. Number 1, colonialism. Number 2 is slavery. And to me, those are not histories of Africa. They're just extensions of European history. Those are histories of what Europeans did in Africa. So I thought it was pertinent and apt to write a book where Africans are not just supporting characters in the history of other continents, in other people's history, a history where they are the main characters and we can write about them without always viewing them through this foreign or European prism. So that was the motivation for writing the book.
And at what point during your research on what Britain did to Nigeria, did you become convinced that we didn't quite understand, or we couldn't quite understand Nigeria's colonial past or even our contemporary history without first understanding what preceded the advent of the British?
Well, when I wrote What Britain Did to Nigeria, a lot of the discourse around that and the debate it generated was really around kind of people having the impression that somehow civilization in what is now Nigeria started with the Brits, that before they came, the place was just a dark age. Either nothing happened or the things that did happen were just negative and barbaric. And I wanted to show, no, that's not the case at all. Like, yes, the Brits superimpose a different type of civilization, different types of ideas, but it is absolutely not true that, Africans were illiterate, did not have religion, did not have sophisticated political systems. So I really wanted to challenge those pre-existing negative narratives and excavate from the minds of especially young people who think that nothing good would exist in Africa without Europeans. So I really wanted to challenge those negative stereotypes and say, hey, look, pre-colonial Africa was no different in terms of civilization, sophistication from any other part of the world. The only difference was that when the Industrial Revolution unfolded, one continent in the world just had better weapons and technology than the rest of the world, and they used it to their advantage to conquer the rest of the world.
Exactly. And how has this historical amnesia, just our conscious removal of history from our curriculum, or our conscious refusal to examine our past, distorted our understanding of Nigeria, the challenges we face today, or even the sense of possibility, a sense of who we can become, what we can become? How has this refusal to explore our past affected who we are today?
It's done a few things. Number one is it makes a lot of young people feel like everything that's happening in Nigeria now, it's new, it's not. They just think that everything is unprecedented. This is the first time it's ever happening. And B, that, oh my goodness, this is the worst that Nigeria has ever had it. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was this debate on social media where a lot of young people, and this is not a criticism because they were not alive during the military rule years. Military rule ended over 25 years ago, and they were just convinced that, oh my goodness, this is the worst Nigeria's ever been, and we need to go back to military rule. And it was this tremendous debate from people who were alive rather during military rule, telling them, you have no idea what you are asking for. You don't want to go back to, as bad as things are now. Trust me, things were much worse if you were alive in mid-1990s or 1980s Nigeria.
Yeah.
And then another one is also viewing things as unprecedented. And I'm going to give an example from the forgotten era. If you ask a Nigerian, when did Nigeria's first military coup occur? 99.9999999% will say, oh, it was in January 1966. But as I showed in the forgotten era, no, it wasn't. It was actually in the 1800s in the Southwest. And incredibly, the fact pattern that caused both the 1966 coup and the one I'm referencing in the 1800s were almost exactly the same. It was preceded by a political crisis in what is now southwestern Nigeria. A political leader from the Southwest formed an alliance with a northern group. And in the unfolding drama, the controversies from those political alliances started this domino chain of events that eventually led to a military coup. So I deliberately inserted that story, and I'm sure lots of listeners know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Afonja alliance in the Southwest. So I wanted just to add that story to show Nigerians that, look, these political dramas and these controversies have been unfolding for hundreds of years, and these things are not new.
Excellent, excellent. And so one of the stories you started the book with is the Nok civilization, and how this civilization produced very advanced terracotta sculptures, iron smelting technology, agricultural practices. And I love how you delved into it to use what we could still glean from the literature that's available to explain the very complex social life, that they had over 2 millennia ago. You know, in fact, if you go further back to, or even around that same period, the iron smelting in Leja around Nsukka, and how advanced that technology was compared to what was happening in the West. And all of these conversations even preceded Rome. What does that reveal about the level of sophistication of early Nigerian societies, and what it should tell us as a people as we deal with the issues we're contending with in these contemporary times?
Well, there's a few interesting things about the Nok terracotta. One is that just in contemporary times, we just tend to view them and interpret them as artwork. But to me, their value transcends their visual appeal, their artistic appeal. It says a lot about the level of organization and sophistication of the quote unquote Nok people that made them. Like, one thing I noticed about, if you look at what the terracotta depicts, number one, there's one that showed a couple in a loving embrace.
Yep.
There's another one that showed people playing musical instruments. Others showed people in religious gatherings. We've even found the tool that they used to make the terracotta. Now, if you add those things together, those examples I've given, music, love, religion, technology, every single one of those four things, that's a marker for civilization. And
Yep.
this is way, way back. We're talking, as you said, before the Great Wall of China was built, before Rome became a republic. And the North area was absolutely massive. It started in probably what is now southern Kaduna State, came all the way down through the Middle Belt, down to Benue State. So it wasn't just localized. This civilization, this sophistication I'm talking about, wasn't just localized to a small area. It means that across a huge area of what is now modern day Nigeria, there were advanced people that far back in time. And again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning, that look, in the pre-colonial era until just a few centuries ago, there were the asymmetry in power and technology between Africa and the outside world wasn't that great until the outside world suddenly became really, really good at manufacturing ships and really, really good at manufacturing weapons. So I think these are things that people should take pride in, and again, use to push away those negative assumptions about African intellectual inferiority.
Because I mean, when I as I read the book, what I saw was, a missed opportunity. I mean, if you think about like Greek or Egyptian mythology and how we've studied these over time, and because of all of that history, we tend to arrogate, knowingly or unknowingly, some level of superiority to these peoples. I see it as a huge missed opportunity that we don't have this compelling narrative about who we were, and to show how, if we can get history back in our curriculum, if we can raise kids starting our history back in like the late 19th century, mid 18th century, how we may find that as a way out of this very defeatist posture that we've adopted in our relations with the rest of the world. I mean, that was a big takeaway for me as I read the book, and I wonder if that was one of the things you set out to achieve.
Absolutely. I'm always bemused when let's just talk about the local legends in Nigeria. The Oduduwa legend, for example, the Bayajida legend in northern Nigeria. We tend to just dismiss them as, oh, it's just folklore, it's useless. Who wants to know about this? But then we have absolutely no problem studying Greek mythology and learning about um, the Minotaur and Medusa and so on. We just think, oh my goodness, that's just classical. And I just think to myself, why is it okay to believe in a half man, half beast mythology, but all of a sudden believing that a man's sons and grandsons became seven kings? Oh, that's just completely outlandish. Why should we accept that? So I think to me, I always use this phrase that Nigerian history is box office. Those stories about Oduduwa, Bayajida, even the Ifa corpus, the amount of intellectual knowledge buried in those allegories, metaphors, whatever you want to call them, to me, number one, they have two values. One is it has this integrative value, because if you notice, the legends in different parts of Nigeria, they coincide. So, for example, the Bayajida legend, it exists in both Borno and Hausa folklore. And even if you go beyond the Hausa states, in the Sokoto Caliphate folklore, the Oduduwa legend, the Benin monarchy accepts it. Then the Benin monarchy's story of origin is also accepted by the kingdoms in the southeast and the south-south. So these stories have a way of integrating Nigeria as a whole culturally. And number two, just in terms of intellectual capital, to me, they are no less qualitatively valuable than the Roman and Greek mythology on which European civilization is built.
And you've mentioned the Bayajida legend a few times, and I'm not sure how many people on the call have read the book, but I'm sure they will after this. So I wanted to see if you could dwell a little bit on this mythology. Maybe it's a mythology or maybe it's real history, on this legendary Iraqi prince who shows up in where is northern Nigeria today. It has the 7 legitimate sons and the 7 bastard sons, and how that has become quite relevant to contemporary Nigerian politics.
Sure, happy to do so. And look, I'm sure there's a few people on the call who know what the legend is, but just bear with me for the sake of those who are not familiar with it. So when we think of the history of northern Nigeria, it just tends to be dominated by the Sokoto Caliphate because it's more recent. We hear less about the Hausa states that preceded them. So before that, the Sokoto Caliphate was formed in the early 19th century, there were 7 states existing in what is now northern Nigeria / southern Niger. And they had names very similar to states and cities in northern Nigeria, like Zaria, Zamfara, etc. So basically, the story of those 7 states is that the founder or the founders of those states, their first kings, were the sons and grandsons of a Middle Eastern wandering hero called Bayajida. And apparently Bayajida migrated from the Middle East, settled in Daura, the hometown of Nigeria's former president, Muhammad Buhari, and married a local queen. And the offspring of their union then spread out and established these city-states in northern Nigeria, 7 city-states called the Hausa Bakwai, literally the Hausa 7. Then in addition, the legend kind of has a tangent that references 7 other states, the so-called Banza Bakwai. I'm just going to use it's not a polite term, but the literal translation is illegitimate 7. And to me, that story of the Hausa 7 and illegitimate 7, it's telling a story of how the Hausa monarchy came to be, and number 2, also explaining in Arab allegorical terms the history of neighboring non-Hausa states that perhaps the Hausa did not have good relations with. Because in that Banza Bakwai, the illegitimate 7, let's look at some of the states that were included there. One was Kebbi, which had a history of fighting Hausa land for hundreds of years. Number two was Oyo, which also had military conflicts eventually in the 19th century with northern states. So I think rather than taking the stories literally and just saying, oh my goodness, this just sounds too outlandish to believe, I think the people who constructed these narratives, dealing with perhaps a population that wasn't entirely literate, had to find metaphorical and allegorical ways of compressing really, really complex social events and histories that occurred over hundreds or thousands of years into bite-sized chunks that perhaps non-literate people could absorb. So I think it's not a case of, do we accept it as fact? Do we dismiss it? I think there's a middle ground where we say, hey, there's historical kernels buried in these stories in an allegorical, poetic way.
But there are parts of the story that we know really, happened. So, for instance, there was a Nana Asmao, there was a Queen Amina, and what I learned for the first time from your book is that there were queens in Daura. And my question, therefore, is, in these pre-colonial times, it appears that women held quite significant economic and political influence. And there are ample examples from the book. What then happened? And I think there's a point in the book that you mentioned, the point where it appears there was a departure from the prominent role that women held, and where women now gradually faded into the background as we have today. What happened, and what can we learn from these pre-colonial times in promoting gender equality, women's participation, not only in the North, where we definitely need that kind of emphasis, but across the whole of Nigeria?
Yeah, so there's this tremendous irony that in Nigeria today, as you said, there's very, very little female participation in government, especially. But that's a 180, it's a complete reversal from what existed in the pre-colonial era. So I
Exactly.
mentioned the Bayajida story. So that legend actually says that before him, when he got to Daura, I mentioned he married a queen. The ruler of
Yes.
Daura was a woman. And even before her, there were other queens before her. So what he actually did is overthrow a lineage of queens in northern Nigeria. Then if you go to the Yoruba kingdoms, there was a female Alaafin of Oyo. And even in some of the oral history, there was an Oni of Ife that was also a woman. So women ruling is absolutely nothing unusual in pre-colonial Nigeria. And even if we go to the more recent past, probably the most famous business tycoon from the 19th century was a woman, Madame Tinubu, Efunroye Tinubu, who's a namesake of the current president, who, I mean, she did everything. She sold foodstuffs. She was an arms dealer. She was a slave trader. She was even a pimp at one stage. She was even a pimp. So she had an entire a conglomerate business that traversed the whole spectrum of reputable to disreputable.
Mm.
But now, coming to what happened, why did these women occupy apex positions and then somehow they got displaced? I think religion was a big factor, the Abrahamic faiths. As people started converting to the Abrahamic faiths, it overlaid a new moral, cultural, religious order that pushed women to the margins. I'll give an example. Before the Osman Danfodio jihad, in the state where the jihad started, Gobir, there was an official called the Ina, who was almost the vice president, and only a woman could hold that position. When the jihad unfolded, that position was eliminated, and that female authority that existed just disappeared. Conversely, in the Christianized areas of Nigeria, a lot of the Orthodox Christian doctrine from the Anglican Church, the CMS, and so on, the proselytizers were all men. And they brought with them a lot of kind of Victorian era mentality about gender relations, about marriage, about the relationship of women in the family and just in society. And it's ironic that while we think that by adopting European culture, language, writing, and religion, and to some extent Middle Eastern as well, we think that we quote unquote modernized, but we actually disenfranchised half of the population by
Exactly.
doing that.
Exactly. Exactly. Fantastic. And I mean, you've just mentioned Usman Danfodio, the son of the learned. That's the title of the chapter that introduced him in the book. He's probably the most influential Nigerian figure from that era. His jihad, his movement was both spiritual and social. Yeah. How should contemporary Nigerians understand him today? You know, was he a reformer, a revolutionary, an insurgent, a terrorist? You know, what was he? A spiritualist?
So the way that events pan out influences the way we recall them. So Usman Danfodio just has a heroic legend around him in northern Nigeria. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's one, because he succeeded, and two, because the victors wrote the narrative of what happened. So the history of northern Nigeria is very much a victor's narrative, and it's also a narrative written by one family, basically the Danfodio family. It's him, his brother, and his children that wrote the history of northern Nigeria. Now, to answer your question about what was he, that today we just view that jihad is just a religious thing. It just transformed the religion of northern Nigeria by welding religion more tightly to the machinery of the state, and it purified Islam. But there was other undercurrents to it. One is that I mentioned the writing of him and his family. It was also an intellectual revolution, because Usman Danfodio, his brother, his son, his daughter, and his son-in-law, Gidado, who married his daughter, Nana.
Yeah.
Between them, they wrote over 300 different books and publications. Just extraordinary. And that's just what we know. So it's probably more than that. For all we know, it could be double, because probably a lot of their writing was lost or was never discovered. So it encouraged literacy. It encouraged literature. And that part of the revolution just flies under the radar, and we don't talk about that. So the reason why the 18th and 19th centuries are the best known eras of West African history is because of that family, because of what they wrote. But now here's the other side to that. Because they wrote so much, they displaced all the pre-existing narratives. So, you know, we had to explain, probably the people on this call, everybody probably knows what the Sokoto Caliphate is, but very few of them know about the Hausa Bakwai. Why is that? Is because the people who overthrew the Hausa states eliminated the history of that preceded them, because they just felt that those who preceded them were unworthy. So there's a cost to that intellectual revolution. And I'd also say we should, in kind of analyzing the history of northern Nigeria, there's another great protagonist that we don't hear about much, Muhammad al-Kanemi from Borno.
Yeah.
So al-Kanemi we tend to just think that, oh my goodness, the whole of northern Nigeria supported that jihad. All Muslims supported it. It wasn't the case. It was actually very, very controversial. And what al-Kanemi did is that he didn't just militarily oppose the jihad. When the jihad started and spread into Borno, he wrote a series of letters to Usman Danfodio and his family, challenging their right to wage jihad against fellow Muslims, and asked them to intellectually rationalize what they were doing. Why do you think you're right? Why do you think you have a right to do this? And his letters were so dignified, so articulate, so profound, that it actually made the jihad leaders start to question themselves. It actually made them self-reflect and start questioning, like, hey, what we're doing, are we really right? Because this guy is a learned person just like us. He's very, very similar to us. And that diplomatic correspondence between the two sides, it forced the jihad leaders to create a template and intellectually kind of create an intellectual roadmap for what they were doing. And also it creates the most compelling case from fellow Muslims against the jihad itself. So I would encourage people that, look, let's not have this one-sided victor's narrative only. When we analyze the history of Nigeria, let's also read what people on the receiving end of these events thought about them when they were unfolding.
And one of the in that same section of the book, you know, as I was reading it, it so happens that in the office we were also thinking about solutions to the farmer-herder conflict, and when I got to the point where, you showed that these conflicts have been on for probably as far as 220 years ago. I couldn't help but just screenshot because I was reading on my iPad, and sent it to my guys to say, we're dealing with something we don't even fully understand, that there are some historical bases to these conflicts that we've not fully explored. And I wonder how many other challenges we're facing in Nigeria today that find their roots, in those pre-colonial days, but we keep dealing with them as if this is the first time Nigerians are dealing with the issue. So if you could speak a little bit about the fights or the disputes over grazing rights and land use, back in these pre-colonial days, it could help people on the call understand that what we're dealing with has, very deep roots.
Absolutely. And before I do that, I want to just be clear that the primary driver of that 19th century jihad by Usman Dan Fodio was religious.
Yes.
However, it had some cultural and sociological undercurrents as well. Like, one of the triggers for it was the Hausa kings that preceded the caliphate imposed Jangali cattle tax. Now, who did that cattle tax disproportionately affect? It was the Fulani, who were cattle rearing nomads. And the Hausa tended to be sedentary farmers. And incredibly, back then, before the jihad started, the same issues that we have today, what would happen is that Fulani cattle rearers, their cattle would trespass, encroach on Hausa people's farms. The Hausa owners of those farms would get upset, and sometimes it would trigger a conflict, sometimes violent conflict. And in some parts of northern Nigeria, some of the people who joined the jihad were cattle rearers who were upset that the Hausa kings were levying Jangali cattle tax on them, and number two, were imposing fines on them when their cattle trespassed into Hausa farms and started eating crops. So we think that, this kind of pastoralist farmer conflict is new. No, it's not new. The only thing that's new is the people behind it. Today, it tends to have a religious angle to it because the farmers tend to be in one religion and the pastoralists are another religion. And also they tend to be from different ethnic groups. 220 years ago, the only difference was that while the pastoralists were Tuareg and Fulani, ironically, the sedentary farmers were Hausa. So basically, we're having the same conflict unfold. It's just that the identity of the farmers is different.
Now, just to go back to Usman Dan Fodio before I move on, I know that the overarching narrative is, this was a jihad, it was a religious movement, but as I read the letter exchange between El-Kanemi and his family, my takeaway from that was that the religion, whilst Usman Dan Fodio himself may have had a religious motive, an inclination to spread Islam, that many of the guys following him at the time and the structure around him, it was really empire. It wasn't so much religion that they were trying to advance, but they were really trying to acquire empire. And that was what El-Kanemi put to the test in his letters, to say, if we are Muslims, why are you killing us? So is it fair to say that the religion was maybe the starting argument, but it wasn't really what drove the jihad?
So I think there's a couple of controversies there. One is a controversy that's still unresolved till today, because what triggered the jihad is that let's remember that Hausa land was already Muslim. The kings of Hausa land were Muslims already before the jihad. But the trigger for it was, how tightly should you weld religion onto the machinery of the state? Basically, is the state secular? Is it multi-religious? Or is it a theocratic state? That was basically Usman Dan Fodio's grievance with the Hausa kings. Till today, in 2025 Nigeria, we are still having that debate about whether Nigeria is secular, whether it's multi-religious, whether religion is part of the state. So I think that's just an unresolved 220-year-old argument, or maybe even 250-year-old argument that's still ongoing. Then the second challenge was the people behind the jihad. They were not monolithic. So there's this weird thing where we think that, oh, everybody that was a jihad participant was a great Muslim, and all the people that the jihad was targeted about were not Muslims. No, the two sides were completely mixed up. So ironically, you had on the side of the jihad, Muslims and non-Muslims. Against the jihad were also Muslims and non-Muslims. You also had Hausas and Fulanis fighting other Hausas and Fulanis on both sides of the jihad. So everybody, so while Dan Fodio and his family definitely had religious reformist motivations, not everybody behind them had the same objectives as them. And he also had a problem of discipline where, you know, once you start a conflict, it's very, very hard. Once people taste blood and they have the exhilaration of access to weapons, it's very, very hard to get them to stop. So Dan Fodio had that problem where sometimes his followers would exceed his instructions and do things that he did not sanction. So, for example, there was an incident in Yandoto in what is now Sokoto State, where the jihadists let's just say they got overexcited and attacked a community of religious scholars. Now, Dan Fodio didn't sanction that, and Al-Kanemi was appalled, and that was one of the criticisms he leveled at the jihad leaders. But as you said, some people, the jihad leaders themselves, definitely had intention to purify Islam, but along the way, they acquired some followers who were not as vigilant about the religious objectives as Dan Fodio and his family were.
One of the arguments that, you know, pops up every time you discuss Nigeria is this idea of a Fulanization of Nigeria, you know, and it always goes back to Dan Fodio, that the Hausas welcomed him and he then took advantage of their hospitality and Fulanized the North. And that if you allowed Fulanis to spread to other parts of Nigeria, the same strategy is going to play out. You know, so for instance, when the Buhari administration introduced the Ruga, you know, as a solution to the farmer-herder conflict, one of the big oppositions to that was that it's a subtle way of introducing Fulanis into southern communities, and that if we came back there in another decade or two, those communities will have emirs and so on and so forth. But as I read the book, I did not get the sense that Dan Fodio's movement was a Fulanization movement. Although he deposed Hausa kings and replaced them with emirs, that it wasn't an overarching goal. Or am I reading it wrong? But even if it was, you know, at least what's your take on that? Because that would then inform how Nigerians, you know, deal with these issues in contemporary times.
So the irony is the House has actually won the war in one context. So we think that the Fulanis won the jihad. Yeah, they did. The Fulani leaders conquered Hausa land and deposed their kings. So they won the political war, but the Hausas won the cultural war. Because, you know, normally, let's just say the Romans, the Brits, let's look at other great empires. What they tend to do is when they go and invade on other people, they impose their language and their culture on the people. But in northern Nigeria, it was the other way around. The victors had to accept the language, the culture, and the political system of the people they overthrew. So even though the Fulani leaders won the war, they ended up speaking Hausa as the court language. Fulfulde didn't become the Fulbe didn't become the court language. No, they all had to speak Hausa. They married Hausa women, and the political system they imposed was just the pre-existing Hausa political system with some religious customization. So I don't accept that, oh, this was quote unquote Fulanization. In fact, it was probably a Hausanization of the Fulani. It was the other way around.
Interesting. Let's segue a bit to like governance and political structures. I mean, in pre-colonial Nigeria, we had a lot of confederal systems, councils and checks on power, especially in southern Nigeria. What do you think today's leaders can learn from these indigenous governance models to strengthen federalism, maybe even decentralization and inclusion? And I think the big issue we have here is that because we haven't studied these pre-colonial systems and structures, we tend to take the imported structures and implement them. But from reading the book and from exploring other literature, it appears to me that there are some lessons we can learn from our pre-colonial past to strengthen what we're trying to do today with governance and political structures. What do you think of this?
So the pre-colonial states we've discussed so far, the Hausa state, Sokoto Caliphate, Kanem-Borno, Oyo, and let's even mention some of the ones we haven't talked about, Benin, etc.
Benin, Oyo, the
Yeah.
Arabs, yeah.
All of them in contemporary political science discourse operated confederal systems of government for in some cases for over 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of head scratch. I just scratch my head sometimes. In Nigeria, where we're always grappling like, oh, should we have constitutional reform, a restructuring? Should we've had the parliamentary system, then military rule with its hyper centralization. Now there's this American style federal structure. And when we have this debate about which structure is best, I always think to myself, why has it never occurred to anyone to try the structure that existed and that worked for 1,000 years before the Brits came? Why are you always looking abroad for some other system when you had your own system for 1,000 years? I'm always just utterly mystified by that. But of course, that confederal structure, there is a great economic motivation against going back to it, which didn't exist in the pre-colonial era, and that's called crude oil. Because everybody wants access to that oil, which fortunately or unfortunately is only in one part of the country. And everybody knows going to a confederation risks cutting off access to that oil revenue. And nobody wants to do that. So that's the economic challenge that we have against going back to that system.
And in fact, if you look at religion as well, I mean, many of these pre-colonial societies managed religious plurality, diversity, they coexisted. Are there things we can learn from, those traditions about managing faith-based tension in Nigeria today?
Yeah, so I'd say that back then, all the heads of state, the heads of the various political kingdoms, were not just heads of state, but they were heads of religion as well. So the Oni of Ife, the Oba of Benin, the Sultan of Sokoto, etc. The challenge today is that we're now no longer a mono-religious society. It was possible to do that, to make the head of state, the head of religion, say, for example, in the Sokoto Caliphate, because it was a Muslim state. You can't do that in Nigeria without triggering a second civil war. So I do have some sympathy for the political leaders of today, that they are dealing with challenges that the pre-colonial leaders didn't deal with. I would even say they're dealing with challenges that the British didn't deal with, because when the Brits were here, the country wasn't split 50-50 Muslims and Christians. They just had one part of the country that was Muslim and another part that was animist and practiced different religions. So to be fair to Nigeria, it has a unique religious challenge, because it's the only country in the world with its population split equally between Muslims and Christians. The other multi-religious countries, Muslims or Christians are usually in the majority, but it's only Nigeria that has that knife edge 50-50 balance, and it's very, very challenging to manage. And I must actually give credit to Nigerian political leaders, because with the challenges they have on religion, there is no other template anywhere else in the world that they can borrow from. So some of these constitutional innovations that we've come up with, federal character, rotation, zoning, are they apt? Yes. In an ideal world, we just elect the best candidate. We don't care about the person's religion, ethnicity, geographic origin, etc. But look, we don't live in a nirvana. We live in the real world. where
Yeah.
we have to care for people's religious and cultural sensibility. So I actually say that given Nigeria's precarious religious balance, it's actually a miracle that there's not more violence. If you
Yeah.
look at other countries like Burundi and Rwanda, where there's only, I mean, there's even an academic debate about are the Tutsis and Hutus even different ethnic groups? They speak the same language, have the same religion, and yet look at the level of violence. And Nigeria has over 500 different languages, 2 Abrahamic faiths, and actually the violence is the exception rather than the norm, and it tends to be
Exactly.
politically motivated. If you go to major Nigerian cities or the Southwest, the current president is a Muslim married to a Christian. I don't think there's another country in the world where you'll find Christians and Muslims intermarrying, and a Muslim is the head of state and the first lady is a Christian. If
Mm.
anybody knows another country in the world where that's happened, please tell me, because I haven't heard of it. So I think
Mm.
sometimes, yes, let's call out the religious controversies, but let's also give Nigeria credit for handling problems that nobody else in the world has been able to handle.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And for participants, I'm going to open it up for questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A tab. I can see the conversations going on in the chat room, but I can't pick out questions from there. So put them in the Q&A tab. I will read them out and I will attribute them to, whoever posted them. But Max, you must know of this, statement attributed to Awolowo that Nigeria is just a geographic expression. But reading the book and seeing how the similarities in our mythology, seeing how trade flows from both the north to the west to the east, and seeing how even the River Niger and the Trans-Saharan routes, kind of linked different diverse kingdoms through trade. Would you say that we're really that different peoples, or is it all politics? It appears to me, yes, there's some ethnic differences, but in pre-colonial times, it appears that there was a lot more mixing even before the colonials came. And doesn't that then speak to the fact that we are much closer than we tend to portray?
Absolutely. There's this narrative, which I don't agree with, that Nigerians as a multi-ethnic unit wouldn't exist without the Brits.
Mm-hmm.
The pre-colonial states I talked about, they were all like Nigeria. They were multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious. Oyo was not, quote, a Yoruba kingdom. Oyo had Nupes, had Kakandas, had Ebiras, had Baribas within Oyo. It was multi-ethnic. Benin had Igbo people, Itsekiri, other ethnic groups, etc. So none of these kingdoms was mono-ethnic. But we always tend to think that, oh, somehow this Nigeria's diversity is somehow unnatural and it's something unprecedented. Secondly, you touch upon the River Niger. The River Niger is not just a topographical feature. It was a marine highway for trade that linked different people, even in pre-colonial times that now constitute Nigeria. They were interacting, trading with each other long before the Brits came. And I'll give a few examples. In modern day Delta State, Hausa traders used to come to Delta State, and Hausa was spoken as a trading language in Delta State in pre-colonial era. There were Hausa elephant hunters in what is now southeastern Nigeria in Igbo land.
Yep.
Blacksmiths from Oka in what is now Anambra State used to travel to Cameroon, to Benin, to northern Nigeria. These people all knew about each other even before the Brits came. And again, going back to that, my reference to the legends at the beginning of the call, that Bayajida legend referring to the quote unquote Banza Bakwai, that's just an allegorical reference to, hey, here's some of our neighbors that we already know about: the Nupes, the Yorubas, the Bachamas, etc. We know about these people. Sometimes we have friction with them, so now we've created this comedic legend about them called the Banza Bakwai. So to answer your question, what Britain did was create a new political union of Nigeria. But I think the trajectory was already heading towards an economic union of Nigeria. So would would all of the people that now constitute Nigeria have ever united under one head of state without Britain? Probably no. Would they have united even without the Brits under some form of economic unity? I'm convinced that would have happened anyway.
Mm, mm, mm. Now, in the book, you described quite a thriving intellectual and literary culture in what has become known as Nigeria long before the European contact. What aspect of that heritage are most misunderstood? And how could we weave this into our national curriculum, national narrative? Again, here I'm seeking for ways we can lean on our past to feel a sense of agency as we deal with the issues we're contending with today.
I think one is a problem of perception, and secondly is a problem of what I'll call the Nigerian factor. History is just viewed as this quote unquote this kind of very dry academic topic in Nigeria. It's just viewed as this abstract theoretical thing that doesn't impact people's everyday lives. That's not the case at all. I always say, look, in the rest of the world, there's never a year goes by without another book about World War II, about the Roman Empire, about Winston Churchill, about the JFK assassination. These are topics that there's nothing new we can say about it, but there's always a new book about it. But in Nigeria, oh, we write a book about history. Oh, why are we digging up the past? Why are we talking about these things? Why is it that it's only Nigerian history that can't get talked about, but the rest of the world's history is relevant? So that's number one. Number two is, I think, let's look at America. Its greatest export to the world is Hollywood. It has used its movie industry to sell this very rose-tinted idea of its history. So let me give you an example. Let's look at Hollywood film genres. Cowboy and Indian films. No, those are films about the elimination and mass murder of Native Americans. But oh no, it's Cowboy and Indian films. Gangster films. No, those are films about inner city violence in America. Even there's a slavery genre that came out of the slave narratives as well. So they've managed to turn the darkest parts of their history into entertainment. Nollywood in Nigeria is missing a trick by not popularizing some of these great stories we've talked about on this call, by not dramatizing them, putting them on film. To me, the stories of Usman Danfodio, Jaja Vopobo,
fascinating,
Bashir Ongaha in Oyo, Bishop Crowther. Oh my goodness, those stories are no less entertaining than Billy the Kid or Bugsy Malone or whatever classic Hollywood film genre you can think of from the black and white days. And I think that's the next step, because look, let's be honest, not everyone is a book reader. Not everyone has the time or the inclination to read books. But now where we have a population full of Gen Z who are addicted to their mobile phones, who are always staring at their screens. I think it's time to get those stories onto those screens to energize them and give them that sense of pride that, hey, we have our own indigenous stories that are just as compelling as the rest of the world.
I can't agree more, but let me give you another Hollywood story for your repertoire. So I was having drinks with a friend the other day, and he said to me, have you ever wondered how come Tarzan grew up in Africa, lived amongst animals, and he was the only person who could learn animal speak, but Africans who'd lived with these animals for centuries couldn't learn animal speak. And while I was still reeling, with that one, he said to me, and when he decided to fall in love, he fell in love with a blue-eyed blonde, although he grew up around all these beautiful Africans, so that's another one for your repertoire. But anyway, so another question is on community resilience, accountability. You talked about the decentralized Igbo and Yoruba systems, title systems, and how they promoted accountability, social mobility, where no one's son can become somebody. How might these indigenous models inform grassroots democracy, maybe even anti-corruption efforts today?
So I think I'll answer the last part of your question, because I think it's a big problem holding Nigeria back. The lack of accountability, number one, the lack of justice, number two. I mean, recently there was a series of pardons in the past month or so. It was less than a month ago, where the
Yeah,
federal government pardoned a bunch of people.
yeah,
So it got to a point where, look, is there any accountability? If you look at the crimes that some of those people committed, I'm not going to mention names.
yeah,
Everybody's on social media. You can see
yeah.
these are very, very serious. Some crimes against the state. Now, if we go back to why and how this started, after the Civil War, because it was not a war against an enemy state, it was between members of the same country. The then federal leader, General Gowon, had a challenge of, how do I end the war, then reintegrate the defeated side and make the defeated side and the victorious side live together as fellow countrymen and women again. And the way to do that was to grant an amnesty to both sides. That was supposed to be a one-off, just to ensure national survival and to overcome the wounds of the war. But somehow it has just extended beyond its intention. And now amnesty is just a response to every crime. So you look at every national controversy, oh, we give amnesty to resolve it. So, okay, the Niger Delta militancy, how was that resolved? Amnesty. The insurgency in the Northeast, what is the current prescribed method for resolving it? Oh, give them amnesty. The banditry in the Northwest, what's the solution for that? Oh, give them amnesty. So it's getting to a point where the punishment for taking up arms against the state and for committing crimes is to be forgiven and given jobs and money. Now, what message does that send to law-abiding people? It sends a message that, oh, crime pays. And is that incentivizing? If you're a young person, if you're a young 20-year-old, what are you thinking? You're thinking to yourself, well, why should I even be law-abiding? Because the people who get rewarded are those who break the law. So I think this is a real national conversation that needs to take place, that, look, at some point, are we going to punish wrongdoing, or are we always going to reward law breaking with forgiveness and amnesty?
I'm not even sure if the narrative is that crime pays. I think the larger narrative is that if you really want to do crime, make sure it's vicious enough, that the government would have to kowtow to you to stop. So don't indulge in, if you want to steal money, don't steal 1 billion, steal the whole central bank, and then, and then we'll beg you to return some of it and then give you an OON at the end of the day. But anyways, so I'll take some questions from participants. I see one from my friend Felix Obi. The question is, the Westphalian concept of statehood was enshrined in the Treaty of 1648, which forms the foundation of modern states, differing from our traditional governance systems in Nigeria and indeed Africa. What do you think about the governance and leadership challenges we continue to experience in Nigeria vis-a-vis the indigenous models of government in pre-colonial Nigeria? Let me build on this a little bit, because I think maybe part of what he's saying is, if you look at that seminal work by Professor Richard Joseph on prebendalism, where you find that when a Nigerian gets a political appointment, it is assumed that he hasn't been appointed on his own merit, but that he's holding the office in trust for his people, his community. So when he embezzles money in the name of his community, it is almost what he's expected to do. This is at variance with this Westphalian concept of what a modern state should be, what governance should be. How do we reconcile what appears to be a subpar model with where we should be going with a modern state?
So I think more than at any point in time since 1960, the trajectory of Nigeria's political evolution is starting to resemble more and more what existed in the pre-colonial era. And let me unpack what I mean by that. So, you know, the 6 zones, the 6 geopolitical zones that were created in the 1990s, if you look at those zones, each of them resembles the pre-colonial societies that we talked about. So the Northwest zone is the Sokoto Caliphate. The Northeast is Kanem-Borno. The North Central is the parts of the North that resisted the Caliphate and refused to be incorporated. The Southwest is Oyo and the other Yoruba kingdoms. The South-South is Benin. And the Southeast is the autonomous, decentralized societies. So the problem, though, is that those geocultural zones, they don't exist anywhere in writing. They're not in the constitution. They're just in our minds.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than having this expensive duplication of 36 states that don't have any cultural relevance whatsoever, they're just arbitrary borders, I wonder if the funnels for development, both economic and political, should be those 6 let's not call them geopolitical, let's call them geocultural zones instead. And also, what I'll say is that, is it absolutely necessary for all parts of Nigeria, all the states, all the geocultural zones to have exactly the same political system? Can't we have some kind of discretion that allows the geopolitical zones to have minor customizations or even great customizations to their system that coincide with what is culturally relevant to them and what they have been used to from time immemorial? Because to me, it's just ridiculous that, say, Akwa Ibom State and Kebbi State, given the difference in culture between them, I'm just picking 2 states at random, need to have the same political system. It's just, to me, that's just absurd. There's no need for that. So I think that's something that we can explore going forward prospectively.
And this question from Chudi Obi builds on your response. His question is, if we looked at the Igbo version of governance, you know, and he says not counting Aro or Onisha, you know, for obvious reasons, these were Republican forms of government, you know, and his question is, would adding non-centralized government forms in a traditional sense be good for Nigeria?
I don't know about Nigeria, but certainly some parts of Nigeria, because I always say this thing, like, so since the person who asked the question spoke about the Southeast, so let me localize this to the Southeast. I always say that, you know, in the Southeast, if you look at the other parts of Nigeria, they always have at one point in time, there's always one political leader, undisputed. So at one point in the North, it was Ahmadu Bello, then it was, you know, Buhari, then in the Southwest, it was Awolowo for a long time, then it was Abiola, now it's the current president. But, you know, in the Southeast, there's only really been one point in the history of, you know, modern Southeastern Nigeria where they've had an undisputed political leader.
They were forced to have an undisputed political leader.
Exactly. After that, just think right now, if you said, okay, who's the undisputed political leader of the Southeast in the last 25 years? You really can't pick anyone. And I say, why is that? It's because if you go back to the pre-colonial history of the Southeast, they're not used to having one undisputed political leader. So this is nothing new for them. And I always say, look, why is it the Southeast fought? That was a region of Nigeria that resisted British rule the most, that fought against them, literally did not give the Brits peace from day one until the day they left. Why is that? So I think to myself, look, these are people who, they don't even want one of their own people to rule them. They don't even accept one of their own people to rule them. So why do you think that you, an outsider, when they don't want one of their own ruling them, why do you think that they want an outsider to come and rule them instead? So I always think, like, you know, some of the political resistance in the Southeast, I don't think any of that is really about, oh, Nigeria per se. I think it's just cultural expressions of people that are not used to, again, excluding, you know, the Delta State and Onitsha, those kingships. These are just people that just have a natural reflexive resistance to centralized political leadership.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, you know, my dad in his philosophical moments would say that, you know, Igbos don't follow any human being, they follow ideas. You know, so it's a concept that they bow to, not a human being. But that's a completely different conversation. I have a question here from Tope Fashua. He said, in what language did El Kanemi correspond with Danfodio?
Arabic.
Arabic. And in the book, you shared a little bit about El Kanemi's educational past. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So one thing to remember is that the leaders of that era were a lot more multilingual than we are today. So I mentioned the Danfodio family. Most of them could speak 3-4 different languages. They spoke Hausa, Fulfulde, Arabic, and Danfodio's daughter, Nana Asma, also spoke Tamashek, the Tuareg language. Al-Kanemi himself, although he was an indigen of Borno, he wasn't actually raised in Borno. He lived in Libya. He was actually born and raised in Libya, also lived in the Middle East, and he was biracial. His dad was an Arab and his mom was Kanembu. So he definitely spoke Arabic, definitely spoke Kanembu, perhaps spoke Kanuri as well. We don't know, but he was literate in these different languages as well. And back then, Arabic was the language of scholarship and was also the language of the elites.
Fantastic. I have a couple of questions here that are kind of related from Adeboyega Igun. The first one is, if we as Africans, both on the mother continent and in the diaspora, had to do one thing, to enhance the image or reputation of the African, what would you ask that we do? I like this because he's moved to action. Yeah.
Stop speaking so negatively about Africa. And what I say was like, America, I'm sorry, I'm going to use America again. With all their problems, racial inequality, economic inequality, violence, gun crime, they never talk about those things. When you ask about their country, what they say, oh, it's the land of opportunity. It's the leader of the free world. It's, it's
manifest destiny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's only in Nigeria where nothing good happens. There's absolutely nothing good has happened according to the national narrative since the beginning of time. Yes, I'm not saying let's bury our head in the sand about the problems, but sometimes let us also be proactive and be positive about the good things that happen. Like I've mentioned a few, like the multi-religious coexistence. South Africa, we forget that when Mandela came out of prison and they were trying to design a constitution for a multiracial society, they looked around the world for constitutional templates to copy. And you know whose constitution they copied? Nigeria. But these sorts of achievements get lost in the national discourse of negativity. So I would say sometimes let's just stop the self-flagellation and sometimes give credit where it's due.
And he continues with a second question, and that's Adeboyega Igun. He said he's read recent works of fiction written with history weaved into the plot, and he gives examples of several books by Tunde Leye. He loved reading the books, but he's a bit concerned at the risk of history being unintentionally altered by this approach of weaving them into fiction. So what's your take on this? And the question is, should we be writing history, fictionalizing history? And can it be a means of getting the younger ones to read more on Nigerian history? And if I tag on my question on the back of that, there are many young people who I wish they would read your book because it's quite accessible. The language is quite accessible, but maybe not. Are there any plans of maybe writing a different version of the book for younger people? So 2 questions there.
So I'll answer the second part of the question first. The answer is yes. I'm actually working on it. So you've now just made me disclose a secret, which is I've actually been working on a children's book.
Fantastic.
That tells some of these stories. And again, just to make it digestible for children, I'm going to break it down into, it won't just be one book. It will be a book series covering different eras and different topics of Nigeria. Maybe I'll start chronologically with the pre-colonial era and I just work our way up to the present. And I'm not looking forward to writing the 1966 to 1970 era for children. I don't know how I make that era palatable for kids. So, but that's a future challenge I have.
Yeah.
Then the first part of the question about fiction and Tunde Leye, I'm a big fan of what Tunde's done. Like I know he wrote Afonja the Rise.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I'm just an advocate of just getting more history out there. So even if he's dramatizing some elements of the history to bring in and engage people more, fine. I'm an advocate as long as he's just encouraging the historical discourse, or if even he makes someone curious and they pick up because of his work a real history book. I'm happy. What I try to do is straddle a middle ground between academic history and general trade books, because I don't want to bombard the reader with jargon. It just puts off the reader. You know, if I start just having all these scientific terms, the person, they find it impenetrable and they just won't read the book. So what I try to do is be scholarly rigorous, but also pick on the topics on history that are the most engaging, that have the most captivating personalities, that make the reader suspend belief and forget that, hey, what I'm reading is not fiction. This really happened, but it gives me the same suspend belief, fantasy, and enjoyment as if I'm reading a novel.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure you figured it out with your editors, but I found Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. An interesting read. I wanted the kids to read it. And I found that he had like a comic version of the book, and it quite resonated with them. So maybe something to think about. But a question from Michael Orekie. He thinks that pre-colonial Nigeria got values and morals right. I put a big question mark on that one. And possibly law enforcement without outside influences. How can we pick up the pieces and get at least our morals and values right like our ancestors did? So maybe the first question for you, Max, is what's your read on how well our forebears did in terms of values and morals and law enforcement? And are there things we can learn from their experiences that we can bring into the modern age?
Sure. So look, I've talked about, the pre-colonial era having an intellectual revolution, being politically sophisticated, etc. Those things are true, but I don't want to give the impression that it was a land of innocence and the land
Exactly.
of milk and honey.
Mm-hmm.
It also had a dark side. I'll give some examples. And slavery existed in every part of the country, and the Sokoto Caliphate that I talked about was a big slave holding state. I don't want to just pick on them, but them, Oyo as well. The Caliphate at one stage had 2 million slaves, more slaves than any other pre-colonial African state. Oyo enslaved its own people, sold them to transatlantic slave traders, and a lot of the people who are actually responsible for education and advancement in Nigeria, people like Bishop Crowther, the Johnsons, John Christopher Taylor in Southeast Nigeria, Jaja Opobo, these are all emancipated slaves, or the children of emancipated slaves. So, let's, yes, mention the intellectual, political, economic achievements, but let's also acknowledge that that era also had a dark side, kings burying their servants with them when they died and so on. That was just an unnecessary waste of lives. I think the parts that we can borrow and seek to emulate is where political leaders were accountable. So I'm going to use Oyo as an example. The Alaafin of Oyo, the king, he wasn't unimpeachable. If he was judged guilty of cruelty or misrule, his council, the Oyo Messi, who we can think of as his cabinet ministers, could depose him and sentence him to death. Now, this might seem ultra violent, but what it did is it created an incentive for the king to behave reasonably and to exercise his powers in a non-capricious way. Now, in Nigeria's constitution, we have a clause that basically makes elected officials completely immune. And then after they leave office, they go to a secondary retirement home where they remain immune for the rest of their lives. So I think the thing we can borrow is that, look, just because someone is in power, that should not mean that they are above the law and they can do absolutely anything they want without repercussions.
Fantastic. There's a question from Samson Ezikeanya. Um, So his question is, where do we go from here in advancing this history with the youth, with university students, with our current leaders? But I think the last part of his question is what is probably the most prescient, which is, will studying this history bring up hidden wounds and deepen these sentiments that we're still struggling to deal with? Aren't we running a risk that by studying history, studying Biafra history, for instance, that we run the risk of refighting that war?
So I'll start with the second part, the last part, which is the most challenging part. Because this is a narrative that I hear often. Oh, why are we bringing up the past? Why are we digging it up? It's just rehashing old wounds. So I'd ask the question of this question: would you ever go to an Israeli or a Jew and ask them to stop talking about World War II because, oh, it's bringing up old wounds? I think you wouldn't. I don't think you'd ever dare do that. Would you ever go to a Vietnamese person and tell them not to talk about the Vietnam War because, oh, it's bringing up old wounds? Would you ever go to a Rwandan and tell them not to talk about the 1994 genocide because it's bringing up old wounds? Just forget about it. No, you wouldn't. So why is it only in Nigeria where historical discussion is forbidden? The rest of the world talk about more problematic issues than we do, but in Nigeria we're afraid to talk about these incendiary issues because, quote unquote, it will bring up old wounds. Have we considered the alternative? That perhaps the reason why they are still wounds is because people refuse to talk about them, and it creates a contested narrative of national history. Perhaps by discussing them, each side will hear and understand the other side's perspective and understand that, look, the other side, they're not devils with horns in their heads. They're not going to serve you for breakfast. They don't eat babies at night and so on. That's another alternative. Then the issue of, look, how do we encourage greater dissemination of history? I don't know if the person who asked the question was on earlier, but I think, answered that, which is, I said, the Nigeria's film industry is missing an absolute trick. We need to popularize these stories on film, on TV, because not everybody reads, but everybody watches TV, everybody watches films, and everybody uses their mobile phone. So we need to send the stories to where people's attention is already focused.
Mm, mm. There's a comment here. It's not a question, but from an anonymous attendee. He's pushing back on one of the points you made. He said, you argued that the Fulani conquest was more political than geographic, suggesting that their continued use of the Hausa language means that Hausa won. However, I disagree. The Fulani's adoption of Hausa was a strategic choice for administration and communication across a diverse region, not a sign of cultural or linguistic defeat. They still preserved their own language, Fulfulde, and reflecting their pragmatic governance and strategy and maintaining their cultural heritage. Any response to that?
No, I mean, my intent is not to get people to agree with me. If he wants to disagree, that is, he can interpret the facts differently from me. That's absolutely okay.
Fantastic. There's a question from Ayodeji Kolawole. Is it correct to say that the current clamor for criminal Sharia is a continuation by other means of the Fulani Jihad?
No, it's not. I think there's a number of things going on. So just view this from the point of view of somebody who lived in the Emirates, say, before British rule. Sharia existed. Then the Brits came and disapplied some parts of the Sharia legal code. So they interrupted something that had been there for about 100 years. Then the Brits left. So the people in that area think, oh, hang on a sec, the people who disapplied our criminal parts of our criminal code have departed. So we don't need to disapply those elements anymore. We're in control now, so we can do what we want. The problem, though, is unlike before the Brits came, they're now in a country where half of the people are Christians. And that was one of the points I brought up, that we're dealing with challenges that the Brits didn't have, the pre-colonial people didn't have. And it's also a clash of different political ideologies, there's a lot of people who think that being a secular state is very much a European Judeo-Christian idea, that it's not an African idea. Because as I pointed out, in the pre-colonial era, the heads of the various kingdoms were heads of state and heads of religion. So the Oni of Ife was a religious and political leader, as was the Sultan of Sokoto, as was the Ezenri. The Ezenri was in Igbo land, was also a religious leader as well. So
Yeah.
there's actually some sympathy for that argument that, look, by saying that Nigeria is secular, no, this is just an alien construct. It's not what naturally exists in this part of the world. Then also, I have this challenge to people who think that Nigeria is secular. Find me the section of the constitution that uses the word secular. There isn't one. You won't, because it doesn't exist. Also, the so-called Nigerian secular constitution has sections that talk about Sharia courts of appeal. The so-called Nigerian secular country sponsors religious pilgrimages to the Middle East. What kind of secular country? What kind of secular country sponsors religious pilgrimages and has sections in the constitution dealing with the operation of religious courts? I'm just going to leave that question out there for people to consider.
Yeah. So again, just focusing more on the positive and way forward, I have a question from Chioma Obu. Given that colonial narratives often overshadow indigenous histories, how can Nigeria's education system better integrate pre-colonial history to strengthen national identity and civic consciousness amongst young Nigerians? And I think the question here is really, maybe a how to do it. So I'm assuming that the government now knows it needs to do it, but because our history is a bit contentious, like every other history is, how do we navigate this to ensure that the history we put out there is actually factually correct, and that we don't debate the facts of it, but we can have arguments or whatever about how it may make us feel, but the facts are the facts. How have other nations gone about this, and how do we need to navigate this?
So I tend to view Nigerian history as a collection of local contested histories. There's very few historical narratives and events in Nigeria where there's agreement across the country. And, the Civil War, the military coups, June 12, you name it, there's always a contested narrative. So I think what we should actually do is, rather than trying to create one linear narrative, this is what happened, let's create an anthology. Just allow each part of the country to tell its own story. So have an anthology where the different geopolitical zones, or even the states, the different communities, give their own version of these nationally contested events. We don't have to agree, just like the person who asked me a question a few minutes ago about, the Fulani. The objective of history isn't to get everyone to agree this is exactly what happened. Like, say, World War II. The Americans think that, they won it. The Europeans think that they won it. If you discuss the American Civil War, the narrative of that war you get in the north of America and the south of America is very, very different. The north thinks it was a war to suppress slavery. The south thinks it was a war about state rights. Contested histories are nothing new and are not unique to Nigeria. What Nigeria needs to do is just tell the story to begin with, which the rest of the world does, and Nigeria has not been doing.
Yeah. If we go back to, say, the Nok terracottas and the Bini bronzes and the Ibuku, rope art, etc., you'd see that Nigeria has a very rich artistic legacy. In fact, extraordinary in many sense. How can this heritage be protected and mobilized for tourism, for creative industries, for national branding, for our narrative? I mean, for that thing that we say to ourselves. And here I'm thinking of, Jean Didion, and saying that we are the stories we tell about ourselves. For us to achieve agency, for us to believe that we can do this. You know, we almost want to look back in our past to see we did it once, we can do it again. You know, how do we, I don't know. I mean, have you given thought to this? You know, if you were sitting with the president of Nigeria and, you know, you had to advise on how we leverage all of this, our pre-colonial history to chart a course for the future, how do we do it?
I think I haven't thought about this, but let me answer you on the spot anyway. Improvising. What what resonates with me is that those stories of pre-colonial heroes and, let's just say, the artwork, the bronzes and so on, it actually tells a story of how we were integrated. So, you know, when we think of Nigerian artwork, the Benin bronzes is the one that get the most airtime because they're the most famous. They're the one because of what happened in Benin and because they're in the British Museum, my apologies.
Yeah.
But we forget that they're not unique, that they're not outliers. Ife had its own bronze casting tradition. So did Oka. So did in what is now modern day Niger State, the Suede bronzes, etc. So what that tells me is that, look, there is an artistic heritage that was not unique to one part of Nigeria. It traversed the entire country, north and south as well. So that these legacies from the pre-colonial era actually link us. So rather than thinking of it as something localized to one area, this is actually something we can use to build a national narrative. And I mentioned the Soede legend. You know, that legend talks about him going from Igala land to Nupe land, and the Oka blacksmiths were itinerant blacksmiths. They used to travel around. One problem in Nigeria is that, you know, mobility in Nigeria tends to be japa. People leave Nigeria. They like traveling when they're leaving Nigeria, but there's very little internal mobility outside the big cities like Lagos and Abuja, etc. I actually think by creating localized industries and narratives around these pre-colonial stories and these pre-colonial centers of art excellence, it can actually encourage a domestic travel industry or a domestic tourist industry, because we always think of tourism as, oh, something that we need to encourage Europeans and North Americans to do. But what about, in the example I've given, having a tourist route from Igala land to Niger State, saying, hey, this is the route that Soede followed, or even some of the darker points of history, like a British expat, after reading my first book, Oil, Politics and Violence, where I used addresses a lot to mention, oh, this house on this road is where this happened. And she said something which I never thought of. It would be absolutely fantastic if you told the story of the 1966 coups by having a walking tour where literally you walk tourists through, say, for example, the hotel where a senior military officer was shot. Then you walk people to what was then the Federal Guard barracks, where the military mobilized to start countering the first coup. Then you walk them to Dodan barracks, which used to be the seat of power. And I thought, this is fantastic. But I was actually slightly saddened and embarrassed that it was a foreigner telling Nigerians, like, hey, you know what? You've got this fantastic opportunity. You're not taking advantage of it. But if you did it, I'd be so keen to participate in it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you know, just to do a selfish plug here, I mean, I'm involved with Center for Memories in Enugu, and you know, it's already working on things like this. You know, so putting together a space where you can see Igbo history, Igbo memories, and then building a tour of, you know, the old coal mining activities in the city, and just get people to visit and see how these coal miners lived, worked, etc. So there's some of that coming back. Some of the work that you know, Philip Ihanacho is doing in Benin with the Modern Museum of West African Art, you know, could build on that as well. And I think as you know, states begin to look for new sources of revenue, tourism will become a more significant part of that discussion. In the past, when we made money from oil, nobody had to bother with any of that. But I think increasingly we have to, you know, look in those areas. I have maybe one last question, as we are running out of time. It's from Umadare Baba. Do you think the absence of history in our schools is part of the misunderstanding and suspicion that is driving the divisions in Nigeria today? And how can we use our history to strengthen Nigeria's unity? I mean, I know you've touched on some parts of this question, but that could be a way to kind of give you a last word as we bring this to a close.
Yeah, absolutely. The absence of history in the curricula and just in our national narrative is a serious problem. And I'll use a personal anecdote to illustrate this. I had a conversation a few years ago with some Nigerians, and just their misunderstanding of, these are educated Nigerians, by the way. These were engineers, professionals who are supposedly the intellectual elite. The gaps in their historical knowledge absolutely terrified me. It actually worried me. And I remember when I finished talking to them, I spoke to one of them who was my friend, and I said, given what they think and what they don't know, because some of them had political aspirations, I said, I pray that none of them ever gets close to political power. And I also said, if this is the level of historical ignorance among people who are supposedly educated and sophisticated, I can now understand why there was a civil war. I can really understand it, and I can also understand why some of the controversies in modern day Nigeria occur. So to me, history is not just this abstract academic subject stroke debate. It's actually a way for us to see that each other as humans, that the other side, people from other parts of the country, are not just monsters that want to hurt us and want to kill us. It's actually part of our national story, and it's also part of coalescing and bringing people together. And we have again, I keep harping on about Gen Z and technology. We have a tremendous advantage now with technology that it's become easier to spread these stories. So let's take advantage of the technology and start spreading these stories on more contemporary media. Thank you very much to everyone for attending. I really appreciate the conversation, the questions, and the interaction. I'll round up with two things. One is, if anybody has questions for me, I'm on social media on X and on IG. Feel free to DM me on those platforms to ask follow-up questions. I'll do my best to respond. And two, if anybody's actually interested in buying and reading the book, please don't buy pirate copies. Please go to Roving Heights. They sell legitimate copies. Please don't reward piracy.
Max, thank you so much. We were already nearing the end of the conversation. Thanks for joining. And to everyone else, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for today's episode of Development Discourse. As usual, big ideas, important questions, real conversations. Until next time, it's me, Patrick Okigbo. Let's keep building that society we want to live in. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Max.